Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website at weather.gov/Alaska. You can get any updates to our forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we may have out for your area. Also call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can also email us at the address on the bottom of the screen. Starting off, we'll take a quick look at the two advisories that we have out for the state. Both are dense smoke advisories. One is out for the lower Kuskokwim Valley, specifically targeting areas in and around Sleepmute, and that is in effect until 1 a.m. on Thursday. Then as we move up into the more northeastern parts of the state, we have over the Yukon Flats area, dense smoke advisory out for that area as well, and that is in effect until noon on Thursday. Taking a look now at our fire danger, we have a lot of the high fire danger out over much of the interior, extending well out to the west, but it's specifically those areas get into the Yukon Flats area where we do have some of that extreme fire danger. We also have some areas down in the Copper River Basin and headed out towards parts of the Yukon Valley and YK Delta area. Looking at our satellite imagery, we'll see some of the clearing out over much of the northeastern part of the state, but we are seeing some showers develop that could be turning into some thunderstorms. We do have some thunderstorms coming in out of the Yukon Territory that are bringing headed towards our border right now. We do have a couple other areas of low pressure, one weaker low in the northern part of the Gulf of Alaska, bringing some rain to areas along the North Gulf Coast, including areas of the northern part of southeast Alaska. We have another system approaching from the south that's going to bring heavier rainfall to areas of the southern portions of the Panhandle. And as we look further out to the west, we have a frontal system pushing across the Bering Sea, bringing some rain to western areas of the Bering and Aleutian Islands and extending out towards the Pribilof Islands as well. So as we look at our weather for the remainder of the day, you can see that frontal system pushing in, bringing some rain to the Pribilof Islands. There's a lot of fog associated with this system as well, so we are seeing rain and fog throughout much of the Bering and into the western, central, and eastern Aleutian Islands. As we move out towards the mainland part of the state, a little bit of the fog dissipates, but we are still seeing rain showers throughout the Bristol Bay area and up along the west coast all the way to the Point Hope area. Along the Arctic coastline, a bank of fog is sitting just off the shoreline in most locations, starting to push its way back in. And into the Brooks Range, we are expecting to see a continuation of thunderstorms. Down in the Yukon Flats area, as we mentioned earlier, we do have some areas of smoke, and that is extending through much of the interior down into the lower Kuskokwim Valley. We are also seeing some rain for many of those locations as we get into the central and western portions of the interior. Rain expected for south central Alaska, and some rain showers through much of the Panhandle as well, with some more rain on the way from the system to the south. As that system moves in tonight, we are expecting more of that rain to start for the southern portions of the Panhandle, and then we are expecting some lighter showers out ahead of that for northern locations of southeast Alaska. Along the North Gulf Coast, we will see some lingering showers throughout much of south central as well. As we get into the interior, less rain but more smoke down in the lower Kuskokwim Valley, extending through the interior and up into the Yukon Flats area. Areas of fog along the Arctic coastline, mixing with rain as we get west of Utqiagvik, and then rain down all the west coast of the state with the frontal system approaching the area, and rain and fog throughout much of the Bering and Aleutian Islands. As we move into Thursday, some of that rain is going to clear up as high pressure starts to move in, but as with the frontal system pushing into the western part of the state and the Alaska Peninsula, heavier rainfall expected for those locations all the way up the west coast through the Seward Peninsula and Kotzebue Sound area all the way down to Bristol Bay. As we look along the Arctic coastline, a little bit less in terms of rain, but as we drop down into the Brooks Range, expecting to see those afternoon thunderstorms for the central and eastern portions, and we will still see continuation of smoke in the interior part of the state, with more rain further to the south as we get south of the Alaska Range into south central Alaska. As we look down into southeastern part of the state, that frontal system continuing to bring a push of rain with that strong fetch of southerly moisture all throughout the Panhandle at this point on Thursday. As we look into Friday, some of that rain diminishing but lingering for most locations in southeast Alaska, and then rain showers expected all along the North Gulf Coast and into the Kodiak Island area as our one low pressure system moves in, bringing some heavier rain to the island. Looking up into the interior part of the state, seeing a lot of rain showers there, and then as we get into the Brooks Range, expecting some of those showers to be thunderstorms for central and eastern locations. Down the west coast, continuing to see lingering showers following behind our previous system, and that's going to extend down into the Alaska Peninsula. Still going to see some clearing due to high pressure out over the central and western Aleutians. For our low temps for Thursday morning, we are going to see temps dropping into the mid-40s for the Aleutian Islands, down to around 50 for the Alaska Peninsula, into Bristol Bay and the YK Delta area, with AKwx staying a little bit colder, down to 46 degrees tonight. In the lower 50s for the Seward Peninsula, and dropping into the 40s for many locations along the Arctic coast. In the interior part of the state and for the Brooks Range, dropping down into the 50s. However, Fort Yukon going to stay a little bit warmer, only getting down to 60 degrees for Thursday morning. Down into the lower 50s for many locations in south central Alaska, similarly for the southeastern portion of the state. Our afternoon highs on Thursday getting up into the lower 60s for southeast Alaska, with 63 for Yakutat. In the mid 60s for many locations in south central, a little bit cooler along the coastline. Into the 70s in the interior part of the state, and into 60s for portions along the Arctic coastline, right along the water, staying a little bit cooler there. As we drop down the west coast of the state, getting up into the mid-50s for the Seward Peninsula. Gamble only getting up to around 46 degrees. Mid-50s for the YK Delta, and getting a little bit warmer in the Bristol Bay area, getting up towards 59 degrees for Dillingham, 61 for King Sam, and 62 for Iliamna there. Into the mid-50s for along the Alaska Peninsula, and only up into the lower 50s as we look out over the Aleutian Islands, with St. Paul getting up to 55 degrees in the afternoon on Thursday. Taking us into Friday morning, dropping down into the mid to upper 40s for the Aleutian Islands, and that is the same for the Pribilof Islands as well, dropping down into the lower 50s to right around 50 degrees all along the Alaska Peninsula and into Bristol Bay area. Mid to upper 40s for the YK Delta, and right around 50 for most locations around the Seward Peninsula. Along the Arctic coastline, we will see temperatures drop into the mid-40s, with Utqiagvik and Kaktovik both getting down to 44 degrees Friday morning. Into the interior part of the state, getting into the 50s for most locations. A little bit cooler as we drop down to south central, especially eastern locations. Glen Allen getting down to 46 degrees Friday morning. 48 degrees expected low for Valdez, and 51 there at Cordova. Down in the southeastern portion of the state, dropping down into the mid-50s for most locations. Friday afternoon, getting back up right around 60 degrees, with some of the more western locations getting into the lower 60s. Yakutat at 62 degrees for an afternoon high on Friday. Into the south central portion of the state, mid-60s for most locations, staying a little bit cooler along the coast. Cordova only getting up to 62 degrees for Friday afternoon. Into the interior portion of the state, mid-60s, but as we get further to the east, getting up into the mid-70s along the coastline, getting up to right around 50 degrees. Some places getting a little bit cooler there, and then in the mid-50s all along the west coast. We'll be back shortly with the aviation section.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
We'll start off aviation with a quick look at our flying weather here. We do have widespread IFR conditions out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. As we move up into the mainland part of the state, widespread MVFR conditions with some areas of smoke in the interior pushing up towards the Yukon Flats area as well. To drop down into southeastern part of the state, we do have MVFR conditions for much of the area as well until we get up to the north of Juneau towards the Haines and Skagway area. We do have some VFR conditions there on Thursday morning. Thursday afternoon, MVFR conditions take over all of southeast Alaska, and as we move back over mainland part of the state, we do have some areas of IFR in some of the central and western portions of the state, but much of the locations have MVFR conditions with still some smoke remaining in the interior portions, and then as we get closer towards the eastern Brooks Range, we do expect some afternoon thunderstorms as well. Down the west coast of the state, IFR conditions expected, and that's going to extend out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands Thursday afternoon. Friday morning, those IFR conditions pushing further to the east, bringing some MVFR conditions to the central and western Aleutian Islands. Then we have our IFR conditions pushing well into the Bristol Bay area, into the lower Kuskokwim Valley, up all the way along the west coast. And then as we get up to the Arctic coastline, some MVFR conditions expected. MVFR conditions throughout much of the interior, down into south central Alaska as well. And still seeing smoke Friday morning in the interior up towards the Yukon Flats area. Down in southeast Alaska, going to continue to see MVFR conditions for Friday morning. Then Friday afternoon, some IFR conditions sneaking into the northern locations in southeast Alaska. As we move back out over mainland part of the state, most locations staying under MVFR conditions, with the exception of the Kenai Peninsula and out and around in the Anchorage area. Along the west coast, we do have most locations in MVFR conditions, a little bit more IFR conditions right off the coastline of the YK Delta area, pushing into Bristol Bay as well. Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutian Islands also going to see IFR conditions, but a little bit of improvement to MVFR as we get further to the west. For our passes, starting out up north, AKwx should be MVFR as well as Adigan Pass. Lake Clark and Merrill should both be MVFR, improving to VFR conditions in the afternoon, as well as Rainy Pass. Windy will stay MVFR throughout the day, and Isabel Pass will start off MVFR but drop down to IFR conditions later in the day. Mentasta Pass will also drop down to IFR from MVFR conditions. Snider Pass should be MVFR throughout the day, as well as Portage. As we move out to the east, Chilkoot and White will both start off VFR and drop down to marginal conditions in the afternoon. Taking a look at our freezing levels, we have some warmer air over much of the northern part of the state, with those freezing levels rising up to about 10,000 feet. And we do have a tongue of colder air pushing down over from northeastern Russia out over the Bering Sea, dropping freezing levels down to as low as 6,000 feet over some of the places along the southern Bering Sea. So you look out at our icing along all of the west coast, from the Point Hope area down through the west coast and through the Alaska Peninsula as well, between 6,000 to 10,000 feet for that whole stretch. And as we look a little bit further to the east, a lighter area of icing over the Copper River Basin up into eastern parts of the interior, between 6,000 to 10,000 feet there. And all of southeast Alaska looks to have some icing between 6,000 to 10,000 feet. Taking a look at our jet stream, starting off over the south central part of the state, around 95 knots there out of a somewhat northerly direction, curving around our low and coming just to the south of southeast Alaska, around 70 knots out of a southwesterly direction. So look out over the Aleutian Islands, a westerly component of the jet, 115 knots, strongest for our area. Switching, becoming southerly as it moves up the west coast of the state, around 100 knots there. Dropping down to 9,000 feet, we have winds throughout the Bering out of westerly direction, 30 knots there, 45 as we get by the Aleutian Islands. Strongest winds, however, over the west coast, southerly direction, 50 knots there, dropping down as we move over the interior part of the state, 20 to 25 knots. Switching to move around our low northerly direction over the eastern part of the state, and southeast 30 over southeast Alaska. And as we drop down to 3,000 feet, we're going to continue to see those southeast winds over southeast Alaska, 30 knots there, dropping down as we get closer towards south central Alaska out of a northerly direction over eastern parts of the state, 10 knots expected there. But as we move over the west coast, we are going to see those winds pick up once again, 40 knots at this 3,000 feet level, and then that's going to be out of a southerly direction. Strongest right over that Seward Peninsula area, a little bit weaker over Bristol Bay area, 30 knots there. Then out over much of the Bering Sea, we are going to see winds out of a westerly direction, 25 to 30 knots. Taking us to our turbulence, all of our turbulence is going to be along the west coast down through the Alaska Peninsula with those strong southerly winds below 4,000 feet for many of the locations, from Point Hope through the Kotzebue Sound, Norton Sound area, down into the YK Delta as well. Then along the Alaska Peninsula below 4,000 feet expected there. We'll be back shortly with the marine forecast.
When you think of a national park, you probably envision wide-open natural spaces undisturbed by human activity. There are indeed such places, but even in some of the most remote areas of a place like Kenai Fjords National Park in Alaska, the mark of man is present. Marine debris is a menace to the farthest reaches of our globe, and even designated national park lands are not immune. In the summer of 2009, the Resurrection Bay Conservation Alliance, a grassroots conservation organization based in Seward, Alaska, decided to do something about the marine debris fouling the beaches of Kenai Fjords National Park. Marine debris coordinator Tim Johnson had first-hand experience with the issue.
The summer before, my wife and I, Michelle, had done a paddle from Seward, sea kayak paddle from Seward to Homer. Really, our eyes were open to some areas that we didn't realize there was so much accumulation. It was very deceiving up front. You couldn't really get a feel for the extent and impact of it. You've got this nice high tide line that's quite pristine, and you really don't get a picture for the impact, the amount of debris in that area until you get behind those storm berms. You get back into the lagoons and the vegetation around those lagoons. And then you see the absolute extent back into that veg and how intertwined and enmeshed these decades of trash deposition. So we were just appalled by that and said we got to get something together on a larger scale.
The Resurrection Bay Conservation Alliance is a local nonprofit community organization, and they have been instrumental in helping the Park Service obtain funding to get larger boats to help move the debris, and they get volunteer labor and organize the work trips. And so it's really a partnership between the Park Service and the community to help get out and really get a project done that in and of itself any one group couldn't do on their own.
Most of that trash was baggable. However, there were large items, huge, piles of hauser line, for example, that we just had to hoist up onto the boat.
The volunteers didn't just bag, haul, and hoist the garbage, but also carefully recorded what types of debris were collected.
In many ways, the debris itself is a resource. Archaeologists use middens, the trash heaps, as a way of analyzing past cultures. And in one sense, marine debris is a form of a midden. It's a trash heap that left for the future would be something that people could use to analyze our culture. It may not say the best things about our culture or everything that we want, but we need to be able to document what we've done so that we can preserve that legacy, make sure that we as a society don't forget what we've been doing.
We had two larger categories of marine debris that we picked up. Commercial fishing means like, say, gill nets, large hauser lines, anything that would be associated with more of a commercial fishing scale. And then the second category was more recreational fishing and household, which would be general plastics, things like that. So we had about a 75% of the commercial fishing marine debris element, and about 25% of the recreational and household further out the bay. And we had the exact opposite the closer we got to Seward. Within the bay, it was about 25% commercial fishing versus 75% recreational fishing and household.
The trash is not just unsightly for park visitors, but also poses threats to wildlife and marine habitat.
Really one of the larger issues now that you go to this plastic that can really get into the food web and affect the food web differently than something like glass.
These substances, for instance, all these polystyrene blocks that are breaking down into all these little crumbly bits are further breaking down on a microscopic level, and how much of an impact that has, in this ecosystem is yet to be determined, but I think it's got pretty high potential.
Well known that sea turtles will eat plastic bags floating in the water. They look like jellyfish to a sea turtle, and obviously a plastic bag doesn't go well in the digestive system of a turtle. Albatross will see small pieces of plastic floating on the surface and think they're small fish and other food sources, and eat that in their stomachs, especially in some of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. They'll find dead albatross that have starved to death with a full stomach, and it's full of pieces of plastic.
We're affecting our local areas this way, but we need to be thinking about it from more of a state and global, international scale. And most importantly, to try and focus on prevention of it coming in the first place. Because we're just going to see this continuing, to build up on our beaches unless we're able to get a little bit more of an approach on prevention on the front end.
Marine debris is really a global problem, in all the oceans, and there are many different sources. Global shipping is one. Fishing debris from commercial fishing, recreational boating activity on land, stuff blowing off land, washing down streams, people just throwing stuff on the shore.
Though the problem can seem overwhelming, Johnson remains upbeat about making a positive difference.
No, you gotta start locally. You gotta take control of what you can do, and make something with that, and try and move on from there.
Overall, more than 9 tons of debris was removed from the beaches of Kenai Fjords National Park and transported back to Seward to be deposited in a landfill.
People gave a lot to the project in order to make it happen. That was awesome. One of the most amazing experiences I've ever had, being able to put that large of a group of volunteers together, dedicated volunteers to put that much effort and give that much time and pull all the different agencies together to see it all happen was incredible. It was incredible. Yeah, very fulfilling experience.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
For the marine segment, we'll start off with a quick look at our ice edge. We do have strong southerly winds pushing up warmer air, pushing the ice out over the Chukchi further up to the north. And then as we look out to our east, we have easterly winds that are pushing ice to the west. And our area of ice that we had just to the north of Dead Horse is still there, but continuing to melt and may move slightly to the west as well. As we look at the rest of our marine forecast, starting off in southeastern part of the state in the inside waters, we have primarily southerly flow, 10 to 15 knots there. And then a southerly flow becoming more easterly out in the outside waters, 25 knots diminishing down to near 10 as we get closer towards Yakutat. Then on Friday, southeasterly flow primarily in the inside waters, 10 to 15 knots. As we get near Petersburg, northeasterly winds around 10 knots there. As we get in the outside waters, southerly flow around 15 knots, becoming more easterly around 20 knots as we get further to the north, and then westerly as we get even further to the north, around 10 knots there. As we look out over our south central forecast, starting off in the Cook Inlet area, southerly winds 15 to 20 knots there. Weaker winds out over the Gulf, around 10 knots in most locations as we get further to the east, around 15 knots there to a southeasterly direction on Thursday. Then on Friday, primarily westerly direction to our winds over the Gulf and in Prince William Sound, around 10 knots there. Stronger as we get further to the west with a more southerly direction, 20 knots around the Barren Islands and through Cook Inlet, diminishing down to 10 knots, but still out of that southerly direction on Friday. For Thursday, for the Alaska Peninsula, we have southerly winds on the Bering side, 20 to 25 knots there. As we go to the Pacific side, we have southwesterly winds 15 to 20 knots for most locations, seas as high as 6 feet, highest further to the west. As we look into Friday, westerly winds getting up to as high as 20 knots, and then down as low as 10 knots as we get into the Bristol Bay area, still out of that westerly direction. For Thursday and the Aleutian Islands, we have primarily a westerly flow, 20 to 25 knots for most locations, seas as high as 7 feet on both sides of the island. And as we drop out to the west, we do have northwesterly winds, 15 knots there, seas diminishing down to 4 feet as we get furthest off to the west. Then on Friday, we have flow becoming more southerly, around 20 knots, and seas at 4 feet for the western Aleutian Islands. Becoming westerly flow around 20 knots as we move towards the eastern Aleutian Islands. Seas highest now on the Bering side, getting up to as high as 7 feet. As you go to the west coast of the state, primarily a southerly flow. Winds anywhere from 25 to 30 knots for most locations along the coast. As we move out towards the Pribilof Islands, directions switching to a westerly directions at around 20 knots. Seas as high as 8 feet for the Pribilof Islands area and up to as high as 9 feet near Makoriak and Nunavik Island. As we look into Friday, flow becoming more southwesterly, 15 to 20 knots for all locations, a little bit more of that westerly direction as we get closer to the Pribilof Islands. Along the Arctic coastline and western coast of the state, we do have more of a southerly component to the winds along the west coast, around 25 knots there, but switching to become out of the east and stronger as we get along the Arctic coastline, seeing as high as 35 knots with those gale force winds and seas as high as 11 feet north of Prudhoe Bay. Then on Friday, still seeing that easterly wind and seas up to about 11 feet. Gale force winds as we get to the east of Kaktovik, around 35 knots there out of that easterly direction. And then as we move along the west coast, we see that southerly component, 20 to 25 knots for most locations, seas as high as 6 feet there. Quick recap of our weather for tonight. We have a low pressure system moving through the northern part of the Bering Sea. Its frontal system moving through the eastern Bering and into the Alaska Peninsula, bringing rain to all these locations with a mix of rain and fog behind this system. As we move out into the state, we are seeing some of that rain make it to the west coast of the state. But one of the big factors as we move into the interior, we have smoke down in the lower Kuskokwim Valley, and then that's going to push up into the interior and up into the Yukon Flats area, where we do have a dense smoke advisory for the Yukon Flats area in effect until noon on Thursday. And we also have a dense smoke advisory in the lower Kuskokwim Valley, specifically targeting areas in and around Sleepmute. That is going to be in effect until 1 a.m. Thursday morning. Along the Arctic coastline, we'll see more fog, and as we get by Ukqiagvik and areas further to the west, we will see that mix with rain. For the Bristol Bay area, moving into south central Alaska, seeing showers throughout the area. And then finally in the southeastern part of the state, we have a system moving into the eastern part of the Gulf, bringing rain, especially to those southern locations, but continuing to spread further to the north through the night. Then on Thursday, that system bringing rain throughout all of southeastern part of the state, and we are going to see some rain in the interior as well. And then some smoke as we move up further to the north and some thunderstorms over the Brooks Range. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for being with us tonight.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.